And as a result, Trudeau was able to produce the best Liberal showing since the 2000 election, with 39.5% of the popular vote and a 14-seat majority. He then went on to lead a pretty successful parliament, accomplishing most of his campaign promises, but also reneging on quite a few as well. Overall, these last 4 years can probably be best described as 2 steps forward, 1 step back, with a whole lot of compromising along the way. Let's go through a few examples. In respect to labor, his government granted the RCMP limited bargaining rights. But they're also the same government that legislated postal workers back to the job. On affordability, they promised to make life more affordable for the middle class. And in many ways, they achieved this. They cut the middle income tax bracket from 22% to 20.5%, and they cut small business taxes just as much. There's no longer any GST on insulin or feminine hygiene products. Even in housing, they provided benefits to make it easier to afford the down payment on your first home. But on the other hand, they haven't really done much else as housing prices have skyrocketed. Their benefits might have even helped fuel the fire. Further, they took so many tax credits off the books that their income tax cuts were basically a wash. Sure, it simplifies things and makes sure that no one's overpaying by missing a tax credit that they're eligible for, but does it really change much else? Again, good in some ways, but not really in others. They were also quite quick to allow assisted dying, a controversial but I think generally supported policy. And the same can be said for cannabis, which they legalized for recreational use across the country. They even gave provinces control over how that legalization was going to roll out, which was a smart compromise. On the other hand though, they didn't do anything to help those who are currently sitting in prison for marijuana possession. And since weed was semi-de facto legal prior to this legislation, meaning you usually wouldn't get in too much trouble for it, but sometimes you just might, a lot of people sitting in prison for those charges right now are only there because of bias and discrimination. But on the flip side, again, the Liberals' full legalization has put an end to that gray zone, which allowed for that bias in the first place. So that's good. But even on legalization, in a broader sense, they kind of jumped the gun. The science isn't completely clear, but it seems to be the case that using cannabis before the age of around 25 can have serious detrimental effects on your mental development. But the much lower legal age might suggest to young people that it is in fact safe. We also don't have a reliable way to test for sobriety yet, which is a real problem for law enforcement. And more than that, the Liberals used this, in part, to justify random breathalyzer and cheek swab checks, which itself just creates another gray area that allows for more bias to affect people's lives. Another prominent and, again, controversial area of legislation has been on the climate and environment. Most prominently, they implemented Canada's first federal carbon tax. Basically, this is a government-added cost to anything that produces greenhouse gases. The goal is to make it more expensive to do those things, to disincentivize the behavior. Now, I don't have time to go into the climate debate in as much detail as I think the disagreements warrant, so I'll just leave this as saying it's extremely controversial. Both the Conservatives and People's Party not only oppose it, but are making it one of their biggest priorities. The NDP and Greens are the exact opposite and hope to expand the tax. But regardless of where you stand on the issue, I'm sure it seems strange to you that the exact same government that created the tax is also the same government that bought a controversial oil pipeline that would further connect Alberta to the Pacific. Now, I don't care where you stand on the issue, but this is a strange compromise, right? Let's pretend, for example, that you oppose the carbon tax. You might think climate change is a problem, you might not. But you definitely don't think it's worth making taxpayers' lives more unaffordable to fix. Does the government then spending $4.5 billion of taxpayer money to purchase a pipeline make up for that cost? Not really. Now, let's pretend you support the carbon tax. The climate is not only one of your most important issues, but it might even be your greatest fear about your children's future. How does spending billions of dollars to help the fossil fuel industry sound? Obviously not great either. I actually generally admire the work that the Trudeau government has done to consider multiple sides of most issues and make proactive compromises. But this climate setup just seems incredibly foolish to me. It doesn't win anyone to his side. And further, it also feels like a breach of one of Trudeau's keystone 2015 values: Indigenous rights and reconciliation. Now, I find the constant connection that people find between natives and the environment kind of infuriating. At best, it plays into this noble savage trope where they're the embodiment of some semi-divine connection to nature and hold some inherent Assassin's Creed Animus-style knowledge of how to shepherd the earth. It fetishizes more than it respects. And that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about land and sovereignty, especially in British Columbia, where there are very few treaties. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that every single native is against the pipeline. Many actually support it, and projects like it. You'd have to create some pretty gross generalizations to believe that any subsection of society is going to agree on every single issue. But that's not the point. Some nations, or their elected councils, or their hereditary chiefs, are against it. That's the point. And if their government or people are against an infrastructure project slicing their lands, it's kind of concerning that Trudeau is so eager to talk the talk when it wins him votes, but isn't willing to walk the walk when it's inconvenient. And honestly, I don't think that 5% of the population deserves a veto against the rest of the country, regardless of past and current injustices. But again, that's not the argument that anyone's making. Right now, they're not even being given a remotely powerful voice on the issue, and they certainly deserve that. If they can't get it under a government that campaigned on reconciliation like Trudeau did, how will they ever? While we're on the topic, Trudeau hasn't done much at all to increase sovereignty or the capabilities of First Nations governments. And many reservations are still without fresh drinking water, without the political power or resources to do anything about it. But like most things of this parliament, there's a little give and take here. They haven't made as much progress as they promised. But full, true reconciliation is going to be a long, hard, and politically costly endeavor, and their term is still only in its first parliament. It took Justin's father, for example, 4 long parliaments to finally implement a broad change to Canadian government and patriate the Constitution. These things take time, and they are making progress. For one, reconciliation as a concept wasn't really embraced until the Trudeau government started pushing for it. They were also quick to enact the Indigenous Language Act, which gave priority and funding to the preservation and promotion of ancestral and, in some cases, day-to-day languages and ultimately cultures of nations and peoples across the country. And in regards to child and family services, they added traditions, customs, and language to the list of important factors to consider when deciding the best interest of a child. This is an important acknowledgement of the systemic damage caused by the 60s scoop, and it's also a tangible step to revert centuries-long government policy that allowed Native children to not only be taken away from negligent parents, but also ripped from their communities and cultures entirely, often with the express purpose of killing off those cultures. This still allows the government to step in and save a child from a bad situation, but also ensures that we're not just trading one variety of damage for another. Steps are being made towards reconciliation, but they are slow coming, and sometimes they don't feel like a priority. Speaking of priorities, remember when 2015 was going to be the last election fought under first past the post? Remember when Trudeau promised to transition the country to a more representative ranked ballot or proportional system? Me neither. Electoral reform is no longer a priority. It's no longer anything. His government did create a committee to make recommendations on a new system, but ultimately it was decided, not by the committee, but by his government, not to pursue electoral reform. In a mandate letter to his Minister of Democratic Institutions, Trudeau and his staff write, "A clear preference for a new electoral system, let alone a consensus, has not emerged. Furthermore, without a clear preference or a clear question, a referendum will not be in Canada's interest." You know, I'm just spitballing here, but if you couldn't find a clear consensus, you could do a couple things. A, you could make an educated judgment as the executive of the country and pick whichever alternative system you think is best. Then you could send that system head to head with our current system in a referendum, thus divining a consensus. Or B, you could even let the public decide which alternative system is best. You could follow a procedure like the New Zealand flag referendums. First vote, rank the alternatives. Let us know which one of these you like most. Second vote, okay, do you still like this best alternative when you put it head to head with our current system? Again, you divine consensus. If you're a government that has pitched their tent on the idea of broader, more meaningful public consultation, a no vote on the referendum wouldn't hurt your image. It would prove you respect the process that you supposedly support. There is no risk. It would be good for you if you wished to spin it that way. But Trudeau's government didn't. And that says a lot. That's not to say there hasn't been some progress on democratic reform. Again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Reforming the Senate, the upper unelected appointed legislature of sober second thought in our parliament, has been a continual project of Prime Minister after Prime Minister. Pierre Trudeau, Mulroney, Harper, you name it. And time again, they've been met with failure. It's incredibly difficult to actually change anything. Harper even gave up on making official reforms and tried to circumvent the whole thing. He tried to just hold unofficial elections and then promised that he would choose to appoint whoever won. Ultimately, though, this was a non-starter as well. So I actually think that Trudeau's pragmatic approach to the issue, which was small but meaningful, was quite admirable. He cut the partisanship out of the process. The future of the Senate will not be organized into camps of senators who are elected by this Liberal Prime Minister and this Conservative one. He's created an independent, non-partisan committee that will recommend nominees. And then, similar to Harper's solution, Trudeau will follow through. Only time will tell how sustainable this system will be, but it's certainly progress. Give and take. In terms of immigration, the Trudeau government has been incredibly in favor of higher numbers. They're bumping up the count by around 30%, from around 260,000 immigrants a year under Harper to a future count of around 340,000. That's about 1% of the current Canadian population. At first, I think this was actually a really popular policy, but as the last 4 years have progressed, it's become more and more controversial, especially on the right side of the discourse. Overall though, I still think most people actually lean towards the Liberal position, even if they are a whole lot more hesitant to fully buy in. The main sticking points, I think, have been the shift in our immigration system's requirements and goals, as well as the general perception that the government has become soft on its own rules and enforcement. Overall, it's probably fair to say that the Trudeau government has overseen a shift from focusing on economic immigrants and collecting skilled laborers like Pokemon towards a more humanitarian outlook. This has ultimately led to some pretty serious concerns of us being soft on our own rules. You know, people falsely seeking refugee status, being denied status, but then just staying anyway. And it is true, the Trudeau government has been incredibly slow to act on these concerns. But if we're looking at the numbers, the sort of scams that make headlines are a really small piece of the pie. The reality is, most immigrants are still workers or part of the family reunification scheme. You still might not like that, and that's valid, but just be careful about falling for the hysteria. It's also true that the Liberals have relaxed a lot of the requirements for citizenship. We can no longer revoke someone's citizenship just because we think they're a national security threat. They might be a threat, but they're still Canadians. You're also no longer required to plan on staying in Canada after you receive your citizenship. They even removed the requirement for people under 18 or over 54 years of age to demonstrate knowledge of Canada. You could easily agree or disagree here. So, as I was making this video, some news broke, and it turned out that Trudeau has done blackface or brownface, not once, not twice, maybe more than even thrice. And here just seemed like the best place to sort of splice that in. So the major incident, and the one that first broke, was when he was 29 years old at an Arabian Nights themed dinner. He's the only one pictured in brownface. And so, on the one hand, you can say, 29 years old, that was 20 years ago, all the other examples are probably older than that, let's just get over it. But on the other hand, it's not like it's breaking news 2 decades later that other people have feelings and you might not want to hurt those. There's also a part of me that wants to have a stupid and pedantic debate about the definition of racism, but that doesn't seem like a productive use of our time, because ultimately and very clearly, no matter what you want to call this was wrong. I think everyone, when they see these pictures, at least feels uncomfortable, and I think most people feel outright angry, and they should. They show a complete lack of sympathy or empathy for others. In Trudeau's defense, he was actually quite quick to come out with what I think is a genuinely sincere apology. And that went like this.
In 2001, when I was a teacher out in Vancouver, I attended an end-of-year gala where the theme was Arabian Nights. And I dressed up in an Aladdin costume and put makeup on. I shouldn't have done that. I should have known better, but I didn't. And I'm really sorry.
And now, as the last few days have progressed, a lot of Liberal supporters have come out and repledged their support for Trudeau and said they accept his apology, which has led to a lot of backlash, seeing as most of the people accepting the apology have been white, and obviously they're not as deeply affected by this action. So does their acceptance of the apology really matter? And while I can certainly understand that take, I think we also have to realize that no matter what your race is, we're all heading into a general election in about a month, and we're all going to have to decide whether or not to forgive Trudeau for this action. And that's going to come down to your own personal and political values. On one hand, you might not care at all, and I guess that's fine. Or maybe it really does matter to you, in which case you have to take a step back and not only look at his apology to see if you think it's sincere or not, but to also take a look at his track record. Has Trudeau's last decade in politics been enough to prove to you that even if he's made some pretty awful and hateful mistakes in the past, that he's ultimately on the right course and you support that course for our country, and it's worth compromising on, even knowing what he did 20 years ago? Or does this bring to light a new shade of Trudeau that's ultimately unforgivable for you? Maybe for you, this is the last straw, and it's time to jump ship to another party. Ultimately, that's going to be up to you to decide, again, based on your own personal and political values. How bad do you think these blackface incidents were? And how good do you think a Trudeau government is? And when you add them up, do you come out positive? Only you can decide that. And finally, we have to talk about Jody Wilson-Raybould and SNC-Lavalin. Let's start with the facts. Wilson-Raybould was a Liberal MP from Vancouver. Before being hand-picked by Trudeau as a candidate for the 2015 election, she served 2 terms as the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations. After the 2015 election, she was appointed to the position of Justice Minister and Attorney General, making her one of the most important members of Trudeau's gender-balanced cabinet. Now, that's actually a really interesting position. On the one hand, the Justice Minister is like any other minister. They're a member of government, responsible to the Parliament and really the Prime Minister, and are in charge of their respective policy portfolio. In this case, the judicial system, mostly. But the Minister of Justice is also the Attorney General, which is still responsible to government, but is also generally perceived to serve at arm's length. They're the chief law officer of the Crown, not the government, which is basically just the ruling party that's in power, but the Crown, the government as an institution. In this role, they're semi-nonpartisan and serve as the government's primary legal advisor, as well as the government's lawyer. They're supposed to be just and independent, and that's exactly where the problem comes in. You see, there's this rule in Canada that if a company is undergoing charges for criminal behavior, or if they've been charged, then they can't win any new government contracts for a few years. Which makes sense. And SNC-Lavalin, a Quebec-based infrastructure construction company, was in the midst of fighting just such a charge. And for Trudeau, this was a problem. SNC-Lavalin is a pretty big company that employs a lot of people, and it just so happens to be based in the same province as his own riding. And, probably more importantly, is based in the province that's the most special member of Confederation. The point is, most successful governments need to please Quebec, and that's pretty hard to do if you're exiling their biggest companies. Moreover, it just looks good across Canada to have as much job growth as possible come election time. Anything that makes that more difficult is a problem. So Trudeau and his administration urged the Attorney General, or she could probably say pressured her, to look into the case, which is being litigated by the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, which the Attorney General oversees. You know, maybe we could just make this go away and SNC-Lavalin can go back to employing people with government contracts. She responds by saying, that'd probably be inappropriate, to which they say, how about you sleep on it? To which she says, yeah, no. It wasn't long after that Trudeau had a cabinet shuffle and Wilson Raybould was essentially demoted to Minister of Veterans Affairs. The shuffle, which saw changes to lots of different ministers' portfolios, was triggered by a gap that was opened by the resignation of the Treasury Board president, and Trudeau maintains that's the only reason she had to be moved. But after the news that Trudeau's conflict with Wilson Raybould over SNC-Lavalin broke, it's easy to see how there might be ulterior motives to that as well. And this has had several implications for Trudeau's government. First of all, it exposed minor, but very serious corruption within the government. It soon became clear that Trudeau's staff and SNC-Lavalin executives had had dozens of meetings. At one point, they were exchanging daily updates. And sure, it was good that Trudeau was acting decisively with all the powers at his disposal to protect and promote Canadian jobs. But was that kind of short-term pragmatism really worth sacrificing the rule of law in the long term? Probably not. Trudeau's handling of the ensuing investigation also puts him in a poor light. As the government's lawyer, Jody Wilson-Raybould was restricted on how much she could say because of attorney-client privilege, as well as limits on how much cabinet ministers can reveal about government conversations. Trudeau refused to release that privilege to aid the investigation. And then, later on, when an ethics report declared that his government actions were indeed problematic and corrupt, Trudeau said that he accepts the commissioner's findings, but disagrees. Which, to me, sounds like an oxymoron. It also doesn't look too good for Trudeau that he demoted not only a woman from his cabinet, but an Indigenous woman. Now, I think people are getting a little reductive here when they talk about this like it was an important factor in her demotion. I don't think her race or gender are a really good proxy for who she is in this situation. I think her demotion is more a function of her resolve to hold her ground and her respect for the office of Attorney General than it is a function of her societal classifications. But it's also easy to see how it's really hypocritical for a government that talks so much about their gender-balanced cabinet and their respect for Indigenous voices to demote an Indigenous woman as soon as she speaks her mind. And finally, the affair has had some important changes to the personnel of Trudeau's ministry. Trudeau's longtime friend, principal secretary, senior political advisor, and general right-hand man, Gerald Butts, resigned over the issue in an attempt to diffuse the blame away from Trudeau. And now he's gone. As the affair ran on, Jody Wilson-Raybould eventually resigned from her cabinet position. Jane Philpott, one of Trudeau's most effective ministers, who served as the Minister of Health, Minister of Indigenous Services, and President of the Treasury Board, also resigned over the Liberals' handling of the issue. Eventually, they were both kicked out of the Liberal Party caucus and are now running as independents in 2019. Ultimately, the importance of SNC-Lavalin affair comes down to your own personal choices. If we take a step back, the actions of Trudeau's government aren't really that bad or egregious, and honestly the whole thing is pretty small. But you could also see it as a behind-the-scenes look into Trudeau's Liberals that's indicative of how they do everything. Knowing how they acted here, can you trust them on the bigger things? That's up to you to decide, and the same is true with everything else. They legalized marijuana, but in many ways, they miss the point. They're fighting a hard battle in the name of a carbon tax, but they also bought a pipeline. They're doing more than any other government to promote reconciliation and improve the lives of Indigenous communities, but they're still neglecting them in many regards. So you have to make a choice. Every government has things that they prioritize and things that they neglect. They have to if they want to get anything done. And it's up to you to decide if their 2 steps forward are in the direction that you want to go, and if that's worth sacrificing the things that they're stepping back on. For a lot of people, I think that answer will be yes, but only you can decide that for yourself, based on your own values and priorities. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is actually one half of a 2-parter. If you'd like to watch the other half, which goes over Trudeau's earlier career, that'll be popping up somewhere over here and you can click on that to view it. Since the 2019 election is rapidly approaching, I'll also be releasing videos on all the other party leaders as the election gets closer and closer. And by early October, I'll hopefully have completed another video that compares all the platforms in a decent amount of detail, and you can check that out once it's ready. There'll be a playlist link somewhere around here that'll have all the election videos up as they get uploaded. These videos will also be available in podcast form, so if you'd like to check that out, that'll be linked in the description. And thanks for watching.